Welcome, everybody. My name is Marion Westgate. I serve as the president of the parish board here at First Church in Belmont. Today, I will also be your moderator. Thank you for spending part of your Sunday afternoon with us. I just wanted to say a few words about logistics before we begin the program. So as I just mentioned, all of you are on mute and your cameras are off, so not to worry about that. The meeting is scheduled for 1 hour. We will have 30 minutes of presentation, and then we wanted to leave plenty of opportunity for your questions. So there will be 30 minutes of Q&A. Just a couple more things about Zoom. So in this format, you are allowed to, and we encourage you to ask questions, and you can do that by going to the bottom of your screen. There's a little button that says Q&A with two bubbles. And if you click on that, a window will open and you can type your questions. And we encourage you to ask questions as we go along, and then we'll look at them together at the very end. Lastly, this webinar will be recorded, and I will share the link to the recording with you all soon. Chris.
Well, welcome everybody also. So wanted to begin with a little bit of a chalice lighting and beginning with all of us together. So invite the panelists and all of you at home. We can just say our usual chalice lighting that we say together when we're gathered, and that we've been saying in lots of ways now that we're remote. So please join me in saying, life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this great gift. So glad that we're here. So glad this is beginning. So glad for all of you, for all of our staff, for all of our leadership, for all the good work that's brought us to this point. So yeah, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. So I want to begin today by acknowledging that these are really unusual times. The COVID-19 virus is affecting us in very unique ways. And one thing is for sure, it is hitting all of us as families, as employers, as employees, and as church members. I would also like to thank our staff who encouraged us to hold this town hall today, which we've never done before. Not in person and definitely not virtual, and openly share information with you all. The UUA also recommends holding these, especially during times of crisis. Over the course of today's meeting, you will hear a lot about the finances here at First Church and an update on staff compensation. And as I mentioned, you will have lots of opportunity for question and answer. I also would like to mention that this is really meant to be an ongoing conversation rather than sort of an one-off meeting and now we're done. We will have more opportunities for information sharing and question asking in the future. So today you will hear in this order from Jonathan Wolf, who is the chair of our finance committee, from Ann Dexter, chair of the Fair Compensation Task Force, and Ian Garvey, member of the Town Hall Planning Committee, but better known to you all as Director of Music. So Jonathan, thank you for getting us started.
Thank you, Marion. Okay, I think at this point in time, I'm going to share my screen. As Marion said, I'm the chair of the Finance Committee. We've been meeting over a number of weeks in order to figure out what we're going to do financially for the coming year. It's been particularly challenging to plan this year, as I'm sure you can imagine. What I wanted to do is start up this conversation just to make sure that people are a bit brought up to speed. You know, I mean, we live these numbers that I'm going to be showing you and you know, budgets and finances. We live and sort of breathe these every day, but I know, you know, not everybody that's on this call is probably familiar with them. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a primer, a little background on what church finances typically look like on a normal year. There's no year that is perfectly normal, but Just to give you a perspective, this is the one that ended 2018, so a couple years ago. And it sort of illustrates the main sources of income and expenses that we have at First Church. We get nearly, about 80% of our income comes from pledges. We do get some from rent. We get some from fundraisers. That includes things like the auction and the musical. We get some money from endowment and a little bit from interest and other sources. And then we get, some income from offering and other donations, but it's primarily from the pledge. And then on the expense side, we have a variety of different categories. These are sort of high-level categories. Personnel is far and away the biggest expense that we have, because we're we're primarily an organization that does that involve people. And we do have a debt service that we're paying down as a result of the building activities that we did in the past. We've got building maintenance, snow removals, and a variety of other sources of expenses that we pay every year. But that gives you a pretty good snapshot of what a typical year looks like. So the way we get to a budget every year, it's not that complicated most years. We do the pledge drive. We look at the results from that. We estimate how much we're going to get from endowment and rentals. Those are sort of the inputs from the income side. And then we look at the non-personnel expenses, which don't vary too much, but utilities, can go up year to year. Sometimes we experience changes in snow removal costs. UUA maybe goes up a little bit. And then, it's really a case of taking that income, looking at the expenses that we really don't have very much control over, and then we primarily start with providing some sort of cost of living increases for staff. That's the first thing that we think of. Maybe there's some merit increases or other small amounts for new programs. We also do need to pay a little bit of attention to the building fund as well. But it's a pretty straightforward process, and there's just not a lot of room for negotiation. So in fact, I put this in just so that we could have a little source of amusement. This is actually from when I was the parish board president in 2013, and I was in Marion's position, and people were constantly asking for things like ice machines or copiers or new hires, and I felt like I was this evil Bond character, Dr. No, because I kept having to say no. And the reason why is because there isn't any magical pot of money that's hiding anywhere, and so it's a straightforward process, and it makes it really challenging for us, as we're trying to put together the budget. So I want to show you one more thing before we get into the fair compensation, and that's just to give you a sense. That's like an individual year, how we spend our money and how we go about the budgeting process. This gives you a little sense of how that's changed over time from 2016 to 2019. So there's a bit of a span in years. And like I said, categories vary a little bit from year to year. Sometimes we have a snowy winter and that affects things, or, sometimes in this particular case in 2019, we didn't have a fundraiser. We didn't do an auction that year because we had the capital campaign. So that's sort of a little unusual. But this gives you a pretty good sense. What's happened over time is our pledges have gone up about more than inflation, so that's good. We've had a sort of a steady increase in our pledge contributions, but even more so, we've had really solid increases from the rent. We've rented out the building quite a bit more. That's made a big difference, and our endowment contribution has gone up a lot because of two reasons. One is the stock market has done better, and the other one is we've actually used a little higher percentage over time. We felt more comfortable doing that. On the flip side, most of that increase has been taken up by increasing building and utilities costs. We have an older building, it's getting older every year, and in some cases, the maintenance costs are just are higher than others. This one was a particularly challenging year, 2019. We had about $15,000 higher in building and utilities that year than we expect to have this year. So it's a little bit exaggerated. But that gives you a pretty good sense that, over time, we've had rent and endowment increases. They've been eaten up a lot by building and utilities. And so it's made it's hard for us to be able to increase the personnel contributions as much as we might want to. And I wouldn't read into this change in the personnel that it's, you know, those are salary increases. There's different people, different positions. There's more changing than just that, but that gives you a high level sense. So hopefully that's a little bit of background. And at this point in time, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Anne to talk about specifically the personnel situation.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan, and hello, everyone. I wish I could see your faces. So I am going to apologize. I'm going to be looking off to the side because my notes are on my second computer off to the side. And I just want to be sure that I stay on task and make sure that I cover all the points I'd like to cover. So we've had a fair compensation task force that's been meeting over much of the past year. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about where that came from. Last spring, as David was leaving and after the budget had been voted on by the parish, we received a letter from staff noting concerns that they had about fair compensation, and particularly around what they were paid, for how many hours, for what period of time, and in particular in comparison to guidelines that the UUA develops for use by congregations as they consider how to set salaries. So a task force was formed consisting of me and Sam, Michael, Griffin, Penny, Chris, Marion. And we met a handful of times over the course of, I think maybe late fall, but certainly into the winter and even into the spring. And the process that we use to take a look at staff concerns and understand them and assess them is we reviewed what we are currently paying staff and on what basis. And we compared those against these UUA guidelines. And to give you a little bit of background about the UUA guidelines, the UUA provides a lot of resources for congregations as they think about what type of employer they are, and what types of things you ought to offer in terms of salaries and benefits and whatnot. So the compensation guidelines take a look at what position a congregation, or what positions a congregation has, the size of the congregation, and the geographic area that the congregation is in, realizing that different positions have different market values and pay different amounts. Different sizes of congregations might have different resources and be able to afford more or less. And geographic areas can certainly impact what compensation is, because different areas have different costs of labor and costs of living. So the UUA creates salary ranges for each position that a congregation might have, with a minimum, a mid, and a maximum. You might be familiar with that from your own employer. And after doing that analysis, we determined that we were not paying all of our staff, at least at the midpoint of the UUA guideline for their position. And in some cases, we wanted to think about how many hours we were paying for and for how many months during the year we were paying for, given what their effort has become over the course of time. So we developed various scenarios about how we could get staff to appropriate salaries over a limited period of time, factoring in kind of what seemed possible for us to do in light of our other financial obligations, which Jonathan just reviewed in general. So as late as February, here's what we wanted to do. We came up with a set of recommendations, reviewed them with the Finance Committee, took them to the Parish Board, and I believe I'm correct, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe there's pretty much unanimous agreement by the Finance Committee and by the Parish Board that this is what we wanted to do for staff. We wanted to move all staff to around the midpoint of their UUA benchmark jobs if they weren't already there. And in the past, again, I think based on past kind of too much in the past history, salaries, the UUA guidelines assume a 40-hour work week. And in the past, some full-time staff had worked closer to 35. So the guidelines have been prorated. And we certainly agree, and this is a concern by the staff fairly enough, that they were in fact working full-time, full 40-hour weeks. So we wanted to stop doing that and make sure that we were paying our full-time staff based on a full 40-hour week. So that would, cause an increase. For our part-time staff, and our full-time staff are paid over 12 months. For part-time staff, our part-time staff have been paid over a 10-month period, basically during our church year. And they fairly pointed out that there's planning time involved and that they spend some time during the summer planning for the upcoming year, particularly, I would assume, maybe in August as we get closer to the start of the church year. And so we decided that it would be fair for part-time staff to increase their schedules from 10 months to 11 months. So they had this paid planning time built into their salaries. So those are the changes that we wanted to make. Basically move people at least to the midpoint of their UUA benchmark job if they weren't already there. Not prorate UUA salary, so full-time staff are being paid a full 40 hours, and increase part-time staff from 10 to 11 months if that's what they wanted. And very importantly, in the future, commit to keeping salaries at least around the UUA midpoint on that kind of based on those hours and months, and to manage our budget to achieve that goal. There have been different times over the course of many years where the congregation's gotten closer to UA guidelines, and then we might fall back if there's a big expense for something else. But we felt it was important that because the composition of the parish board and the finance committee changes every year, we felt it's important to put that stake in the ground so that future boards know that this is how the congregation has decided that we want to manage our budget to be sure that we're paying our staff fairly, in accord with the fair compensation guidelines of the UA and in accord with our UUA values. And we modeled out different ways to do this, and ultimately we decided, and then the parish board and finance committee agreed, that we thought we could get to where we wanted to be over a 2-year period. And we thought we'd go as far as we could and at least halfway in our upcoming fiscal year, fiscal 21, more if we could, but at least halfway. And then we'd go the rest of the way in fiscal 22. So that's what we wanted to do. That's what everyone agreed on as late as probably mid to late February, and then COVID hit. So with that, Jonathan, I think I kick it back to you.
Okay, now I get to share my screen again. And let me just march ahead one more slide here. And here's where the news starts to get not so good, or a little more challenging. So, this is an opportunity to provide a little bit of an update on how the pandemic has impacted us. And what you'll see on the left, it says FY 2020. That's the column that's the year we're currently in. These are projections that Penny provided us for the end of the year. The fiscal year doesn't end till the end of June, but this gives you a pretty good idea of where we think we're going to be. And the pledge number, by the way, at the top, that includes what we call current year pledges, people fulfilling their pledge this year, but also some amount of prior year pledges, people that didn't quite get their money in on time last year, and this sort of rolls over to the next year. So there's always a little bit of variation in that versus what we think of as the pledge drive. But we have, one of the most substantial things we have here is we have a hit from a pledge perspective. It looks like we're going to be around $16,000 less than last year in terms of total pledge income. The rent is going to be a few $1,000s lower, right? Because we're not having the church open and available for renters. So that's sort of the bad news on the income side. We do have some, positive things that happened this year compared to the previous year. If you remember back, you might not remember, but the previous year's debt service, if I scroll that back one year, the debt service in earlier years was about $74,000 a year because of the capital campaign contribution. We were able to pay down a chunk of that debt. And so the debt service this year is dropped by $37,000. That's a really big contribution on the reduced expenses side. But yet, if you net all this out, Fundamentally, we're expecting we're going to have a shortfall of around $12,000. And this could vary several thousand by the time we get to the end of the fiscal year, but definitely looking as if we're going to run into deficit this year. Without the capital campaign, I want to point out that this number would be more like 50,000. So that capital campaign has really made a huge positive contribution to this year's situation, and I thank everybody that contributed to it. As we look forward to 2021, however, it looks even more challenging. The pledge drive was pretty successful this year, and that's really great. And we hope to get some increases in pledges, but we're expecting a really big hit in rental income, primarily because we are unlikely to be able to rent the place at all this summer. We already know that one of the major renters this summer is not going to be using the building, and I don't think the other one will be either. So that's around 25,000 right there. Plus, we expect reduced rental use in the fall. So that's a huge impact to the negative. And these are projections for 2021. We're trying to do planning. This has not been, authorized. Certainly, this is something that the congregation votes upon. So I wouldn't presume that this is going to be the final answer. But this is what we're looking at for numbers. On a positive perspective, if we're not using the church as much, there'll be some reduction in things like electricity use and some utilities. Another positive thing is that we expect that we're going to pay down more of the debt during the year, and so you'll see another looks like a $21,000 positive impact as a result of that debt payment. But if you start adding these things up and you assume we want to continue to keep our staff at least whole in terms of maintaining the compensation that in the face of inflation that's going to be happening, we know we're going to be negative. The good news is that we have a stabilization fund that we built up over the last decade, and most years we've been able to make some contributions to that during that period in time, and it's at a very healthy level right now. So we're comfortable that we can absorb the loss this year, a more substantial loss the next year, and still have a healthy amount left in case things stay bad even for one more year. That's the sort of thinking that we have at this point. We want to have some cushion given the changes that we're seeing are happening so quickly. It's very difficult to plan ahead, but we feel pretty comfortable that we can achieve at least, we can achieve at least some amount of staff increases in compensation and still have a viable, protective layer in the stabilization fund at the end of next year and accommodate this. This is still a work in progress, but I think this gives you a pretty good idea at this point. So let me just try to summarize these things. So you've seen the longer term picture where we've come, near to maximizing the rental income. I mean, next year we don't expect to be able to rent the building out as much as possible, but even a little further down the road, back when things are normal, we're pretty much using the building almost full time, and there's a limit to how much we're going to be able to add to that. The investment income isn't going to be increasing much because our endowment is not growing. The stock market is not being helpful in that respect. Our debt payments, we're not going to be able to reduce them beyond zero, and in a couple of years, they are going to be zero. We're probably near the peak of our fundraisers, and we have things that increase every year. Our UUA contribution increases every year, utilities usually increase, and our staff certainly needs to have their compensation increase on a regular basis. So the challenge we face as a congregation is we need to be really careful in how we spend our money. We want to spend every dollar wisely and pay attention to the details there. But most importantly, we as members of the congregation really need to think carefully about our pledges, pledge generously, and that's really the measure of the health of a congregation. A congregation can't grow and achieve what they want unless you've got the commitment of the members making meaningful contributions, and that's the lifeblood of the church community in a community perspective, but also most definitely from a financial perspective. That's my pitch to you, Marion.
Okay, we will hear from Ian next.
All right, thank you very much, Marion, and thank you everyone for being here. First, I know I speak for the entire staff when I say we love working here. It's a vibrant, loving, generous, and kind community. All of us believe strongly in the work we are doing, and we are very proud of what we do. We're a skilled team and experienced staff who work well together, and this continues to be true in the time of COVID-19. We are especially proud of the way we've adapted our work and programming to the evolving needs of the community in this pandemic. It has been our pleasure to step up and show up for the community by providing quality worship, music, programming, and connection. And yet, with that said, it is important for all the staff to receive a living wage for the work that we are doing. And to date, that has not quite been happening. Most of the staff, myself included, have second jobs to pay all of our bills. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, most of those jobs have been lost. I also need to note that a staff salary below the UUA standards minimum, where most of the full-time staff has been every year, sends the message to us that we are not valued and our work is not valued, which is especially disheartening at this moment. That is why we as a staff are so grateful to the Compensation Task Force, the board, the Finance Committee, and Chris for all of the work that has gone into the idea of bringing staff salaries up to a living wage. We recognize that this took a lot of time and commitment from a lot of people, and we thank you. What this process has also made clear to all of us is that the congregation as a whole mostly has no idea what the staff are paid and how that correlates to the UUA standards. It was our idea as a staff to share our salaries openly with the congregation going forward, and our thanks to the board and finance committee for agreeing so readily. This is important to us for a couple of reasons. First, as I mentioned before, a person's salary does directly reflect the implied worth that person has to their employer, and having a salary below the UUA recommended entry level for a position has had an impact on staff morale for quite a while now. And second, as we are employees of the church, our employer is technically you, all of the members of the church collectively. My sincere hope is that sharing our salaries openly is a move that is symbolic of a new transparency and open communication between the staff, the board, and all of the members of the congregation. This year, Chris started the practice of having us all write a report for the board every month, outlining what we have been up to in our area of the church. These reports are available on the website, and I encourage you all to read them. And finally, on behalf of the staff, I want to thank all of you, the members of the congregation. You are the reason that this is such a wonderful place to work. Your passions, your talents, and your gifts are what make this community so special. So thank you all for your time, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Marion.
Great, thank you, Ian. So just a reminder to everybody that you can ask questions by typing them into the window that pops up when you click on the little Q&A button, the Q&A logo. It's at the very bottom of your screen. If you can't see it, hover with your mouse and then it'll appear. And before we go on to the Q&A segment, I would like to just take a quick moment and echo what Jonathan said at the very end of his presentation, that First Church really depends on every single person's generous support. Thank you to those of you who have already fulfilled their current pledge for the current fiscal year and have sent in their fiscal 21 pledge. And I'd like to encourage everyone to consider giving a new pledge, an additional gift. First Church is truly only possible because of your support. So thank you. Okay, We are moving on now to the Q&A segment, and I will call on our speakers. I will read the question and then call on our speakers to answer them. I will start with some questions that were sent to me before via email before today. And please note that I took the liberty of editing lightly for length and clarity, some of them. So first question, does the basic salary provided to our staff include such items as professional expenses, medical insurance, other types of insurance required, housing allowance, etc.? And sort of part two of that question, is housing part of the minister's compensation package? And I would love for Penny to take that question.
Thank you, Marion. The chart that you were provided that shows the FY, I had to double check to see what year we gave you, the current year salaries, is just that. It is salaries, except for Luis, who is paid hourly, and this is an estimate of what he will be getting because he's paid for actual hours worked, but obviously for budget purposes, we need to make an estimate of that. In addition to what you see on that chart, full-time employees and Luis get a church contribution to their retirement plan of 10% of, equivalent to 10% of their salary, and they get life and disability insurance. And full-time employees, but not Luis, also have professional development funds. That's $6,000 for the minister and $1,000 for each of the other full-time employees. And they get a contribution to their health insurance if they decide to take their health insurance through the church. Most of our staff actually get their insurance through some other plan. I presume it is their spouses. So those are things that would be considered benefits that don't appear on that chart that you were provided. The church also obviously pays workers for workers' comp insurance and pays for the employer taxes that every other employer has to pay in the Commonwealth and the state, I mean in the country. For housing allowance is kind of a artifact of the IRS and how they handle ministers' housing. For our minister, we negotiate a package, an amount of money, and then part of it is designated as housing allowance and part of it is not. So what you see on the chart, the 112,000, includes for Chris the housing allowance. It's the total value of that. One other thing which you might be interested in, the church does not participate in the state's unemployment program. I always assume that was separation of church and state, not sure. But that means that our staff are not eligible for unemployment. Mary, anything else?
Thank you, Penny. My next question here is, what is the process for evaluating staff and considering merit increases? Chris, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, so one of the great, let me see, I'm gonna try and do this short. Basically, we're ongoing supervision with the staff, and we have a mid-year review and an end-of-the-year review. And so that eventually will feed into the idea of merit increases, but that's a little ways down the line. I've done this process in a couple different congregations, and only once have gotten to the point where everyone was fair compensation. So I look forward to this next iteration because we have a very clear trajectory towards fair compensation. So I think along with the board and the finance committee and the staff, we'll sort of articulate this next phase, but that's kind of phase 2, I think is the short answer.
Great, thank you. I think this is just another sort of staff clarifying. Staff positions are listed as being for different number of months. Traditionally, the church has operated a scaled back program over the summer, and some of the staff was not paid for those months. what is the impact on compensation here, and can you talk about this? Chris, do you want to just take that again?
Yeah, and so so I think part of right now, since this is my first year here, part of what this whole process is we're kind of rectifying what agreements had been made and then what practices are. And so I think part of when we started this, we started looking at, well, what are actual contracts and what do people have in writing? And so we have part of this process, and what we were going to be doing right now before the pandemic and everything was really clarifying that and working with staff to have a clear set of understandings and guidelines around the 12 months, 11 months, and the 10 months. And so I think it's part of what we're working on and will be, because it was a little bit confusing. So there was a cultural understanding of what time off was, and then there was a practical understanding of what was actually being done. I'm sort of rambling. Marion, can you ask me a clarifying?
No, I think that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, because we're on this topic, I want to take one of the questions from that was just typed in. So I looked at the staff salaries, and it seems as though Ian is far underpaid, not only according to the UUA guidelines, but also in relation to all the other staff. What is the reason for this, and will it be rectified? Anne, would you speak to this?
You know, it's great that the staff asked to share their salaries, but I'm a little reluctant addressing an individual salary consideration in front of a group of what looks to be about 86 people. I'd say that, you know, the process that we've been looking at is to look at all staff. And as I said before, to make sure that they are in the right benchmark job, which I think Ian is, and are paid for the kind of a appropriate place within the range. Any compensation structure has a range from a minimum to a midpoint to a maximum. As I said earlier, our staff, some of our staff are below the midpoint, and Ian and I may have a slight disagreement on that, so we can work that out, but it's a good thing about the collaborative process we've now established. So one of the things employers do is take a look at, for each staff, where within that range should they be? And again, looking at a midpoint, but we'll be taking a look at all staff and figuring out where should they be within the appropriate range.
Right. Thank you, Anne. We also had a question that was submitted ahead of time about a recent email that came from the UUA headquarters, where they recommend congregations should plan for the possibility of opening in May 2021. How is First Church preparing for that eventuality? So I think this will be a sort of a multi-part answer. Jonathan, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Yeah. When we put together our plan for FY21, as we're working on that, we had to have a set of assumptions around whether services would be going on, whether the building would be open for rentals, and so forth. The assumptions that go into that assume we're going to have some amount of activity in the church in the fall, but certainly not at full capacity, and we're not expecting rental income, for example, in the fall. It does assume that we will have this starting in January, that things will be much more active and up and running at that point in time. The good thing is we have a stabilization fund that provides, you know, enough flexibility. So if we're off a bit, we can handle that. If we're dramatically off in that, then we'll have to do some replanning as the year goes on. And you know, with the way things are changing, it wouldn't surprise me if we would need to do that. But at the moment, we're not worried that we're just going to suddenly run into a brick wall. that answer the
Chris, do you
question?
want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say my the UUA is dealing with 1,500 or more congregations, and part of what they do is they try and help facilitate conversations in all those congregations. So what they put out was really very much in line with what we've been doing, which was they were saying plan for the possibility that you might be looking at May. And the whole time First Church has been really clearly planning for every eventuality and really with cautious steps. So there's a number of congregations where either the minister or lay leadership are pushing the system to come back early. There's people who are pushing staff to work in unsafe ways. And so I think their goal, the UUA's goal, was to really put the benchmark of a possibility at May. And so the chances are it's going to be somewhere leading up to that. But yeah, so I just wanted to kind of contextualize that part.
Great, thank you. I also, sort of my 2 cents on this is that the reality is that really, truly nobody knows what is going to happen. You know, the UUA doesn't know, the CDC doesn't know, we certainly don't know. And First Church has the advantage of having very strong leadership in our minister, smart and thoughtful people on the finance committee and the parish board. And these people have spent, are spending, and will spend countless hours really thinking all of these things through and making the best decisions with the best information we have at the time. So just for more context. I would like to take a question from the submitted ones. Can we raise the staff salaries to the median, and then if there's a budget shortfall, apply a salary withhold until the financial situation improves? Jonathan, do you want to say a couple of words about that?
Well, we haven't really modeled that out. I think most people that I mean, I can only speak for myself, but having a pay cut suddenly be dropped upon me would be something I would not be really, you know, I don't want to put people in a position, if we can help it, of putting them highly at risk of a pay cut. That doesn't seem like a good strategy. You know, some of the things we've thought of actually work a little on the other end of the spectrum. We want to be able to pay people in a way that is a paycheck that they can count on, because people need to do personal planning. But on the other hand, we've been thinking that if things turn out better, maybe we can do some things either in the middle of the year, one way or another, in order to start to get people moving in the right direction. So.
Can I just add to that? I think one of the things I've really appreciated about Jonathan and the whole finance committee's tack on this has been really trying to make sustainable steps. Like, we are 100%, like we said before, all of the board, all of the finance committee, certainly me, all of the staff, we're really committed to doing right by our staff and doing right by them in a sustainable way that we can keep continuing on. So I think that's kind of one of the guiding principles that we've been working with. So that's kind of why we took that angle.
Thank you. So there's a suggestion here, whether we should clarify the confusion over whether full-time staff salary currently fall within the range set by UUA standards. And do you want to just sort of repeat what you already said?
I think what I'd say is that my understanding is that after you normalize salaries based on not prorating 40 down to 35, and that in particular, that we have, that we staff are not all at the midpoint, but are certainly not below the minimum. And I think that anytime that you've got, I don't know, as I I think it was Mark Twain who said there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, and we want to be sure that we're dealing in the world of agreeing on our numbers. So this came a little bit as a surprise, and so I look forward to working with everyone. And I know Penny's done a deep dive on this, as have staff. So let's get together the numbers and be sure that we're looking at the same numbers and interpreting the UUA guidelines in the same way. But hard to answer that without having numbers right in front of me, which I don't.
Thank you.
Good. I also just saw a couple of the questions saying, what can we do? What do we need to do now? How can the congregation step up? And I think just to underline what was said a couple times, part of the models that we're working with anticipate a higher than usual pledge unfulfillment for this current fiscal year. So that's one simple thing to underline again, pay your pledge if you can, but then also pledges for the coming year. And so people can, certainly help out by either doing what they're already committed to doing or doing more if that's possible. We know it's a complicated time for folks, but just to answer two of the questions there in the chat, that's kind of part of what we can do now and part of why we're having this conversation.
Thank you. This is one for Jonathan or Penny. Are there restrictions on how the stabilization funds are used? Jonathan, you want to take it?
There's no specific restrictions. It's up to the parish board. It can be used in any way. That's anything that's okay by our bylaws to spend money on.
Great, thank you. So do our staff get retirement benefits? Penny, you touched upon that, but maybe you could just briefly go over that again.
Full-time staff get retirement benefits in the form of having, each of them has a retirement fund sort of through the UUA, and the church contributes an amount that's equivalent to 10% of their salary into that fund for them. Those contributions are actually made every 2 weeks because they get paid every 2 weeks, and they directly track what they were paid. Part-time staff do not get any kind of contribution from the church towards retirement. And Luis, for purposes of retirement, is counted as a full-time staff member. Luis's position is a little bit different, I think, in part because he has been with us for so very long that even though he's an hourly employee, people view him as sort of almost like a full-time person.
Thank you, Penny. There's a question here. Given that we are in where cost of living in an area where cost of living is high, it would seem to me our staff should be at the upper end of the UUA ranges. Is there a plan / time frame to get the staff to that range? Chris, do you want to take this?
Yeah, there was a couple of questions touched on that. Yeah, essentially my whole goal down the line is that we're not just fair, that we're exceptional, that people are making enough money that they want to stay here for that. And so I think this is all a very helpful first step. And then, we move on to the higher parts of that range. The other wrinkle is that as the church grows, we pop out of that whole bracket into the next bracket up, but that's a conversation for later time. Sorry, Anne, you were trying to say something. Oh,
I was just going to say that the UUA guidelines already take into account the cost of living in the geographic area. So the UUA guidelines account for the size of the congregation, as Chris said. The larger you get, the more you're expected to pay. But it's also based on the geographic area. So the position of make it up, a religious educator, and the range in the Boston area is higher than the range in a much lower cost of living area, so in Nebraska. So the higher cost of living here is already accounted for within the ranges that we are striving to get to.
Thank you.
Mary could I just
Penny.
say one thing, going back to the question of how much would it cost to get everybody up to, say, the midpoint? And as noted at the bottom of the salary sheet, that's a $70,000 increase in salaries, which translates into maybe an $86,000 increase in total cost by the time we pay taxes and we pay retirement stuff. But if people are looking for increasing their pledges, that's a number they can shoot for.
Thank you. I have gotten a request to clarify that the purpose of the stabilization fund, back to that earlier question, is to address emergencies at the church level.
Yeah, I didn't, Marion, I didn't answer that the best way I should have. I apologize. That is exactly right. I mean, the purpose of the stabilization fund is to account for year-to-year variances that we're going to have. We never come up with the perfect 0.00 at the end. So if we have it's some people call it the flywheel of the financial flywheel of the church, right? So it is really this year in our shortfall that we anticipate. That's exactly what it's supposed to be used for, is that kind of unexpected shortfall, not to normally be spent for any other purpose. That's the intent.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here. Can additional pledges be designated for staff compensation? Jonathan, do you want to talk about the structure of the budget? Just like previewing.
Absolutely. As I was sort of saying, through the process that we go through, most of the things that we have our expenses are pretty fixed. So when we get more pledges, that tends to be where they go anyway. And at this point, we've trimmed things as much back as we can. In fact, the staff were helpful in coming up with a couple places where they thought they could save some money in the coming year budget, and we told them if there's any place we can save it, it's just going to go towards compensation, because that's where the excess will go. So if we raise any more pledges, my understanding and my expectation would be that they would flow directly to personnel expenses.
Yeah, and that kind of answers two of the different questions. And just to kind of clarify this, what we're talking about now is kind of what we can do. The intention was really clear in February that we were going to try and make up about half of the distance that we had to bring everybody up to fair compensation. And so now it's, the question is, what can we do this current year? And so that's kind of the strategy. A couple of you have touched on it. Somebody also asked if we pay Social Security for staff, Penny. Oh.
The answer is yes. Yes, we pay Social Security and Medicare for all of our staff. Okay, so I just want to say that we have a few more minutes left. So now is the time. If you have any more questions, please send them our way. If we have too many at the end, we will take them offline and sort of circle back with you and answer your question. And if you weren't happy with the answer you got, you can always circle back and we will try to clarify. So we have, this one is done. A concrete question about utilities. Why is the cost of utilities still going up after the installation of the solar panels? Jonathan, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, that line item that you might have seen encompasses a number of other expenses than just electricity. So we have, water, we have natural gas for heating the building, and so forth. We actually looked really closely, and I personally looked at the bills in very excruciating detail, very different reports and so forth. The solar panels did save us some money in terms of our electrical costs. On the other hand, we were using the building a lot more last summer, and we have people in there when they turn on the AC and so forth. So there's a counterbalancing factor there. And the solar panels clearly did have a positive impact, but there's a number of other components into our overall utility expenses that sort of weighed that out.
Great.
One other thing I'll say, the way you get, I found out the way you get charged as a church is different than as a homeowner. They have this thing called peak use charges. And if all of a sudden in the early evening when the sun isn't shining, we turn on all the AC and we fire up the parish hall and so forth, that we get whacked with a big peak usage charge that you would never see as a homeowner, but businesses have to encounter. So it makes it a little counterintuitive to figure out sometimes.
Thank you. Are there plans for a second ask by the stewardship campaign? I will just go ahead and answer that. What you are looking at is the second ask, and this does not come from the stewardship committee. The stewardship committee has done an incredible job this year, and especially this year, given the circumstances. So no, there will not be any stewardship committee involvement per se, but if you feel moved to give now or sometime in the future, you can always contact our friends of the stewardship committee and tell them how much you would like to give. So they are definitely there for you. I see a couple of questions about the stimulus and PPP, and the answer to that is very long and complicated. And I am putting together a document that is similar to the Q&A that we prepared for this meeting. And then we will take up questions at the annual meeting exactly a month from now. Because I think the congregation deserves lots of background before we launch into a conversation, and it would take too much time right now. So I'm just looking if there are any other questions right now. There seems to be a conversation going on between questions. So I don't see any other questions that are Ian, do you? Yeah, I don't see any other questions. I'll just give people a couple of minutes and then we will wrap up. So if you have any other questions that you think we can answer now, now is the time.
Well, David does have that. It says, to be candid about whether people aren't making the minimum standard, seems to be disagreement, and then ask Ian to speak to it. And I'll just add, and Ian can say it too, but I believe it's this, we're being candid. Most people aren't making the minimum standard. And that's pretty clear in the numbers that we sent out. So Ian, I don't know if you'd like to say something about that too, but it's, yeah, it's in the numbers that we sent out, so.
Sure, I would be happy to. And I think the source of the confusion is because of, as Anne mentioned earlier, the difference between the 35 and 40-hour consideration of full-time. Up until this year, full-time staff have been paid for 35 hours of work, which is, and according to, for years of tradition at the church, that was considered a full-time position. And the Fair Compensation Task Force made the decision to stop that practice and to compensate full-time staff for 40 hours of work. So because of the nature of full-time positions, as many of you know, it's difficult to keep track of exact hours. So the decision was made that 40 hours of compensation would be appropriate for the full-time jobs that are being done. So the salaries that had been paid the staff in the past were somewhere, for most of the full-time staff, were somewhere between the minimum and the midpoint for a prorated 35-hour version of the UUA standards. But if you look at the full 40-hour recommendation that the UUA makes, then most of the full-time staff end up falling below the minimum since the full-time staff had been paid in the past up through this year for 35 hours. So that's where the difference comes in, and that's why the spreadsheet is the way it is, but you're looking at prorated staff or salaries of 35 hours versus recommendations for 40 hours. And so the decision was made to go for the full 40 hours starting with the next fiscal year. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it is time to wrap up. If there are any of the remaining questions, we will circle back with people. So I'd like to thank you all for attending this afternoon. If there are additional questions that came up after today, please feel free to send me an email and I will try my best to find a good answer for you. I want to thank especially the planning team, the Town Hall planning team, which is Janice Szynski, Ian Garvey, Penny Schaefer, and Chris Jablonski, and all of our panelists today who have worked hard to put this together for you. You will receive an email this coming week with the recording of this webinar. And I also would like to take this chance and plug the annual meeting, which is same time, same place, on June 14th. So a month from today, 2 o'clock, Sunday. We will do a very similar format. It'll be Zoom with Q&A opportunity. More details to come soon, not to worry, but please mark your calendars for that. So, and with that, enjoy the rest of your Sundays, everybody. Thank you.